Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Responsive Weekly. I'm Megan Donahue from Virtuous, and I'm so happy you're here. I see some regulars in the chat. If this is your first time, the chat is active. Feel free to drop your questions, comments, and experience there to share with your colleagues. And joining me today is Noah Barnett. Hi, Noah.
Hey, Megan, it's good to be back. Hey, everyone. I'm excited to be a part of this community today. I always hear for the past few weeks, I've heard the excitement that comes out of the Responsive Weekly, and I haven't been able to be a part of it. So I'm glad to be back, Megan. Thanks for having me.
Got the band back together.
For those that have been longtime listeners, and not first time, I've handed the reins over to Megan. So Megan's in charge of this thing now. So I'll just be the guest.
So now Noah is a guest, and today he is joining us to talk about donor signals. So there's an interesting conversation happening in the chat already that I noticed as we're talking about why do we think donors give and how do we know? I think we've got a lot of ideas of things we feel are true or things we suspect are true. But today we're going to get into more of how we might get real data about donors and what motivates them. So kicking us off, just what we're going to do today, we'll talk about listening to donors and what it might really mean. Noah's going to walk us through the 3 I's of donor signals. You know we love alliteration on the Responsive Weekly, and if there's a way, the 3 C's of donor retention, the 3 I's of donor signals, if there's a way to do it, we'll figure it out. And then we'll open up for questions and discussion. Should be a good chat. So Noah,
Megan, I feel like we should address some of the comments first. Can we jump in a little bit? It's interesting to see, like in the pre-chat, some people said that donors give because they trust the history of the organization. That's interesting.
It is.
They want to have an impact in our world. We have different gifts and passions. We want to make impact related to those. Some says they give to support quality healthcare, so more of the cause. So It's interesting. One saying they give to us because they believe in us. The other says that they give because it's personal. The other says that they want to give to support the outcome, the cause. I think that's an interesting conversation. Like what does drive different donors, and does it vary?
Yeah. My inclination is yes, because if there's one thing we know, it's that there's not like a universal donor, right? That's like a blood donation joke, but there's not a universal donor that is like, this is the one reason that all of us give. It's going to be personal and different for everybody. And I think it was interesting because when we were talking about those 3 C's of donor retention, we were talking about connection, a cause you care about, but also an organization you have confidence in. So maybe it's the intersection of all 3, or maybe it's different for different people. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think this is why we have to have this conversation. And I think that's why, in some ways, we set everybody up in the audience to fail by asking the question. Because in some ways, we do all have our personal opinions as to why people give, but it does vary, and why one donor gives to your organization versus another may be drastically different. I know that was the case with my organization when I was running growth for World Help, which I've shared this story before, but like we saw all over the place. Like some people gave because of a macro tie-in. Brian Funk showing up to the show. Hey, Brian.
Oh, sorry, y'all. Didn't know I'd be on camera.
Do you want to be on the show now?
Oh, man. But yeah, no, there's a lot of different aspects of that. So like, we had some donors that gave because they believed in the macroeconomic like outcomes of our work, and they were kind of thinking about it more for like, what's the biggest impact we can make for our investment. Others just gave because it was like, hey, our family needs something to give to that expresses our values, and so we're going to support this cause or another. But it was much more about them, not necessarily the outcome. And then we had a bunch of people all in between. So
yeah, that makes sense. I see some conversation in the chat. Stephen pointed out that maybe you need all 3 for a donor to act: the cause and the organization and the trust and the care. I made that 4 things, but y'all know what I mean. Miranda's pointing people to the 7 Faces of Philanthropy. Good resource. I love how many resources get dropped in the chat because this hive mind is so powerful.
Yeah. Hey, Miranda, would you be willing to come on and talk about what the 7 Faces of Philanthropy are? I'm going to ask her. We can carry on, but I'm going to see if she wants to come up and share, because
Cool.
I'm actually not that familiar with that. And I would love Miranda's expertise.
Yes.
So
Miranda
let's
has
carry on, and then
agreed.
we'll see if
Look,
we
it
can
is
get,
now a live call-in show.
We'll see if Miranda can come up and hang out with us.
Cool. Let me see if I can set.
There we go. I'll allow her to talk and see if she wants to share.
Cool.
So
great. I'm going to kill the slides for a minute so we can just chat.
yeah, that's great. But do we want to dig into the 3 eyes real quick while we wait
Yeah.
for Miranda and see if she wants to come up on stage?
Yes. Wonderful.
You never know what's going to happen on this show. That's why I love being a part of it. So
Things just happen. Hey,
Miranda's
we've got
here.
Miranda here to talk about the
I'm
faces of
glad I did my
generosity.
hair and makeup. I am Zoom ready, so thanks.
Welcome.
Thank you. So 7 Faces of Philanthropy, lovely book, and I am totally blanking on the author, so I apologize. But the 7 Faces of Philanthropy talk about motivation that a donor has, and as you all are talking about, it's very individual and it's very based on their life experiences. So the faces are first the communitarian, so someone who donates because they want to do good and it makes sense to them. They think that there's order in the world and they want to provide to good order. The next is the devout, so doing good is God's will, so they do it as a result of their religion and they do it as a result of their faith and their belief. Then there's the investor, and you all were talking about that. There are some people who think that an investment in their community is an investment in the overall good, and they're often led by things like tax write-offs and where I come from, the state of Colorado actually provides various different incentives in the way of credits. We have like a child care contribution credit, so you get half your donation back. Those donors, I really entice them with that type of communication. There's the socialites, so those folks that really like being involved in events because they like to see and be seen by others, and they define their own identity through being a part of that social world. The altruists, the folks that just do it because it feels good. It's what resonates with me, and it makes me feel like I'm a good person for doing so. The repayer, so those folks we often see, I had this, and this is what allowed me to advance in the world that I am in. And so I'm going to go back and give to scholarship organizations, or I'm going to give to food banks because I, received from a food bank before. And then the dynast. And so those are folks that kind of get pulled into it because it's part of their family tradition. It's part of their values. Oftentimes those are folks who have, they have donor advised funds, or they have foundations that are set up. And oftentimes you'll get those donors calling you at the last minute being like, I have $5,000 I have to give to some organization. So can I give it to you and come do a site visit tomorrow? So that is how I know the 7 Faces of Philanthropy. So hopefully I did it justice.
That's awesome.
That's amazing.
This is why we do this, because we have smart people in our audience that we should let talk more often. This is amazing. Thank you, Miranda.
Thank you, Miranda.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'll change your role back so you don't have to hang out on camera the whole time. So thanks. That's really awesome. I think what's interesting, and maybe we can start talking about the 3 eyes, is how do you discover where your donors fall into that, type thing? Because it's good to have the reference of these are the maybe 7 archetypes, but how do we discover which donors are which? And I think that's where donor signals really overlaps with some of this. So let's get into it.
Exactly.
So there's 3 eyes that we've identified here at Virtuous as part of our responsive fundraising framework as the donor signals you can listen to or listen for that can help you kind of bridge the gap and identify, what groups do you have in your donor base? And you likely have a lot of different ones, but where do you predominantly have a donor base? Where do you predominantly over-index on? Is it the dynast, or is it the payback or the repayer, or one of the other ones that was shared? So there's 3 layers here. Do you want to talk about the first one, Megan, and I can tackle the second 2?
Sure. So one of the first things to look at is how people engage with you, and we call that involvement, kind of as a first step of how involved are they in your organization and in what ways are they involved. We know there's a difference between a person who's a long-term donor versus someone who's just made their first gift, for instance. It's also useful to look for the other ways aside from donation that they engage with your organization. Like, it's super important information, just like we were talking about with those faces of philanthropy, those if somebody is a past person who's been served by your organization, that's very relevant in how they're involved. If they're a volunteer, if you're talking to your volunteers, like if a volunteer makes a first time gift, but they've been a volunteer for 10 years, and you start talking to them like, hey, you've never heard of us and we've never heard of you, but welcome to the gang, you risk a lot of miscommunication and alienation. So figuring out, have they come to events? Have they, what made them subscribe to our email? Like, how did they get here? How are they involved?
Yeah.
What are they
absolutely.
about with us is the first place to look.
Yeah, and this involvement can be teased out even a little bit further, maybe to some more traditional development functions of segmentation around like RFM, for example.
Yeah.
So the involvement can be, you can tap into RFM or RFM Plus or all the other frameworks out there for donor engagement to really understand this. But involvement, you're right, how they engage is essential. You have to kind of start there. And honestly, this is where you likely have more signals than you think you have in this category, because this is typically what we can search our database for, we can query against, we can identify. If you're using a nonprofit CRM like Virtuous, you can see the involvement pretty clearly at the individual level, or you can begin to tease it out in queries across a larger set of your donor base. The second signal, which is kind of the next layer down, is what they engage with, or what we call interest. Interest is kind of what they're actually engaging with within your organization. What are the themes? What are the topics? Think about it as if you tagged everything in a category. So, is it on the front page? Is it in the at-home section? Is it in the business section? Where are you reading? If you think about the New York Times and there's different sections that are appealing to different interests, your organization likely has a series of sections that you could label as to, okay, well, we do child advocacy, but we also do adoptions, or we do feeding programs. Your organization might focus on, alumni relations, but alumni relationships because of the sports and the legacy, or it could be because they want to give back to students that can't afford to go there. So there's a lot of different topics or things that you're sharing as part of your organization that you can begin to track. And that's where it comes down to interest. So you can see what programs they give to you, but also what things they show interest in through other signals, like even website tracking. So website tracking enables you to be able to see what pages Emma versus Luke is looking at on your website. And if you see that Emma's spending a lot of time in one section of your content, or she's only clicking on emails about X topic and not Y, that can help you identify how to better connect with Emma, but also at a more macro level, other donors that are expressing that same level of interest versus a Luke who might be looking at child adoption or something else.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The other thing here I think is interesting is when you use like the animal welfare example, you might have people that are interested in dogs and not cats, or they might be interested in horses and not dogs or cats, And so how do you begin to kind of almost even create engagement campaigns for the sole purpose of understanding what people are interested in? So maybe you send out a whole profile on dogs and see who engages with that, and make note, hey, these people engaged with our dog newsletter, our dog story, versus the horse story. And I think there's a lot of ways you could tease that out across other verticals. Absolutely. Any other ideas there, Megan, before we kind of dig into the last one?
Yeah, I think recognizing that, I think there's this thing of like, well, we have to tell everybody everything. And I'm not at all advocating that you should keep any of your programs secret, but at the same time, it's like the pull for people's attention is so strong now, and the clutter and the messaging that's just coming at everyone all the time. If you don't have to give everyone everything all the time. You can give people mostly what they're interested in. And I think just making that mental switch of, but how will they know about the dogs if they're the people who care about the cats? Give them what they care about.
Absolutely. And I think you'll drive more engagement. Like if we see attention as the most valuable currency in today's connected world, how do we maintain and steward that attention well? So if someone is engaged with you, how do you steward that? And I think like we all experience it, whether you're an Amazon user, a Spotify user, or a Netflix user, you see how these platforms cater to your interest over time.
Mhm.
And even though you might say, well, we're not Amazon, we don't have the ability to do that, or we're not Netflix, like we're a local food bank, like tell me more about how we model after Netflix. Like the construct of when people are engaging with you, they're engaging with you or they're involved with you because they're interested in something. If they're not interested in something, then I don't know why they're involved with you, but there's some level of interest that's more relevant to them than others. And so how do we lean on those interest points, still exposing them maybe over time to other things? But let's start where the donor is and not where we as an organization want to start. We kind of have this curse of knowledge internally at organizations where we're like, oh, let's tell them this, that, and the other. And you're like, wait a second, have we unpacked the tax we're requiring the audience to pay in education and understanding and complexity before they even can act? And I think that's where then this interest thing is really important. How do we tax our audience less so that they can actually more deeply engage with us? And that's a way to drive connection. And ultimately, this is around relevancy. The outcome of focusing on interest is relevancy, which many guests have referenced over the past year.
Yeah.
So we're ready to move on to the next signal?
Yeah, let's talk about intent, which is kind of where we started.
Absolutely. Tim, that's a great point. He says, act first, inform later.
I'm going to copy that so that everybody can see it.
Yeah, that'd be great. So the last signal that we have here is around intent, why they engage. Now, I want to ask a question to the chat. Why did you show up today? Why are you on this call? Let's just drop it in here. We'll just sit in silence until people start sharing.
What brought you here today?
Yeah, like why did you invest 30 minutes with us today?
Will came
Will.
to annoy people.
Typical. We should have some policies where we kick people out. No, just kidding. We're very open. This is great. I can't even read them because they're coming in so quickly. To learn how to listen to donors better, gaining insights. We're also in the middle of redoing our donor matrix. So now the second question I'm going to ask you, now take your first answer and now ask again, why is that important? What's the second layer to your why? So if you say, I want to learn how to engage those who up until now are just silent donors, I don't know them, but they give. Colleen, why is that important? Like, what's the next level of the why? Mercy for Animals says, raise more money. Money, money, money. Tim. All roads lead back to money. We have some money-hungry fundraisers on this call this morning. Someone says, I can continue to improve and learn new ways to reach donors. All roads lead to donors because confusion. Need funding for programs because we need to understand their passions to raise money, to be more effective, because I become a better leader. So interesting. So in the same way that you came here and you said, this is why I'm here. And then you asked the second question of like, well, why does that matter to you? This is the same thing that we can do with our donors. Like when we talk about the third eye, it's like, why do they engage? And you might get an initial answer. Maybe it's a survey that you do after the first donation. And you can do this for online and offline. So if someone gives online, like why not ask them why they gave right then? Like they just gave. There's a lot of crap that they just went through. No offense to using that word, but like there was a lot of friction that they had to push through to get to the point that they've decided to donate to your organization. And so why not then ask them like, why did you do that? Like, why did you spend the time donating to our organization today and capturing that? But then over time, we want to unpack that further. Like, why does that matter to you? Why does that, like, why is that important to you? And we can do that through both questions over time and making sure we're indexing the answers over time. But we can also do it by just monitoring like why they're doing something or when they visit something and what the timing is of that. I think I did a poor job explaining that. But Megan, any clarity?
No, I think that's great. Is like looking into that intent and then looking for that second layer of what is really the most meaningful thing and what's really driving is very important. And it does put you in a place where you're not making assumptions and you know who you're talking to and what matters to them. And it gives you like so many places for your conversation to go in a way that if you're just like, I guess they're probably giving to make the world a better place, doesn't. Whereas if you're like, I know that there's a significant chunk of our donors who are giving because they adopted a pet from our shelter or because someone in their family was affected by the disease we're trying to cure. And that's a much broader conversation than the kind you can have over a long period of time instead of like, cool, it's good that you want to do good in the world. I agree.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Joanne says, do you suggest starting with a survey if you've never tracked any of this information before? What's your take, Megan? And then I can add some feedback too.
I first of all, thanks, Joanne. You provided the perfect segue because my next question was going to be, but how do we actually do this, Noah? I think a survey is a good place to start. I think building in like secret survey options that are not fill in a whole survey can be good. And what I mean by that is like we were talking about starting to add an option to say why you gave in your online checkout process somewhere, giving people the opportunity to communicate about their preferences when they're communicating about something else. Those are good too. I think there's a lot of good things about a formal, like tell us about you survey too. But if that feels like, I want to survey all my donors, you can just start with those little questions that start building that knowledge too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is those two parts, right? There's like the inline questioning. So like, how do you do exactly what you said, like ask in line? But then I don't think it's a bad idea, Joanne, to start with a survey. So my organization, and again, I use this reference a lot because it's my context, but I think others can learn from this as well, is we did a quarterly survey and we rotated that survey across our donor base. So it wasn't that we were asking donors every quarter, we were asking them every 3 quarters, because we would do a third of our donor base at a time each quarter. So then a donor was getting asked at least every 9 months or so, like with the same questions. And it was very simple questions. Like it was just, why did you give to our organization? Why do you continue to give? And would you recommend giving to your friend, colleague, family member? That's it. We were using like the standard Net Promoter Score questions to really drive that survey, to keep it really simple and consistent. Because if you don't keep the questions consistent across the overall donor base, it's hard to extract insights from that. But one thing that we were able to learn is we were able to take all of the answers to why did you give to our organization, compare them, the actual words that they typed into that box, and then use that in our fundraising appeals. Like the exact words our donors said of why they gave, instead of being like, give today so that you can change a child's life forever and give them schooling and education, we would actually just replace some of those value propositions or reasons to give that we were like kind of attached to, with just the exact words across 1,000, 2,000 surveys over time with what donors were saying, so that we were using that in our fundraising appeals. So that's some of the other implications of this surveying, is you can actually pull the direct words that donors give to you and put it in the ask.
Very cool. Someone asked a question, and I think it's a really good one. It's above all of our flurry of comments, so I'm sorry I can't credit who it was. But with this, when we're segmenting donors and starting to appeal to their specific interests, do you think there's a risk that we're pigeonholing people and missing out on opportunities?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the thing that we can't do, and Gail Perry's great about this. Gail Perry was on our Responsive Nonprofit Summit a few weeks ago. And she said, one thing that we do when we have these conversations, like we're all sitting in this room, we're all fundraisers, we're all thinking about this a lot, we're thinking about donors, is we make too many decisions for our donors.
Mm-hmm.
So even when we say like, oh, well, are we pigeonholing them? It's like, well, is that our decision as an individual organ? Like, where's the responsibility level? Like, is it our decision to say, oh, we are, so we now need to change our approach? Or should we have more open two-way conversations with our supporters so that we can learn and iterate over time as to how the relationship is progressing and what we are exposing them to. I think there is always this kind of macro fear, it's kind of the Facebook feed problem, where it's like, oh, if we just keep giving people more of what they want and what their mindsets are, do we create this like polarization? And I think that is a true thing, but I don't think I would caution in exploration of a feed mindset problem or the Facebook feed problem into your donors at the start, because I think that overcomplicates the problem, which then prevents people from actually asking the questions to their supporters, which prevents us even getting halfway there.
Right.
And so I think there is challenges at scale over time here. But what I want to make sure we don't lose sight of in this moment is like, how do we even start? Like a lot of organizations, like Joanne was quick to admit it, like we don't do this. We don't ask questions to our donors. Like we don't even track this information right now. So what are some of those practical things we can at least start with? So
yeah, and I think it's an important thing too because I've had that macro caution too of like, well, will there be a person someday who does not know that my animal shelter even has dogs? They think it's just like a rabbit rescue because of this, my hypothetical animal shelter example. And I think like we have to compare what's actually happening, like what the real alternatives are. Like right now, the choices are, if I don't segment my donors based on their interests and what's relevant to them, then it's like choice is not they know everything and they love everything and they are really excited about everything. The choice is I overwhelm them with a bunch of information they never asked for and aren't that interested in, and they tune me out.
Yeah.
So eventually, maybe in my cat email, I can be like, want to learn about, or my rabbit email, would you like to learn more about how we combined these things? And here's something you're interested in. And there's opportunity. But if they leave the conversation because I flooded them with impersonal messages, we'll never get to that point.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think there's a bunch of extra interesting questions we should address, especially around lapsed donors and a few other things. Miranda, we definitely see your question. I think that's going to require us to have like a very longer conversation. So I think it might be just fuel for a follow-up conversation or another TR or responsive weekly. So again, I know Megan already said we're not ignoring you. We're definitely not ignoring you. We'll get back to that. I think it'll be better to have a broader conversation, and it might open the opportunity to have you back on stage too.
Now you're a regular contributor, Miranda.
Yeah, Miranda's going to get tapped every Thursday now, and she's going to stop showing up. It's kind of like how donors stop showing up when you keep picking on them, but that's a sidebar. Two quick things. One was we just went through this at Virtuous, right? Like I've been running the Responsive Weekly for a long time. Like we've been sending the Responsive Weekly to our broader Virtuous community. And we had this question of, should we continue to send the Virtuous Insider or Virtuous, I'm getting things mixed up. The Responsive Weekly to everybody in our community? Or should we give people the option to say, hey, we're going to send this to you for another month. And at the end of that month, if you haven't told us you want to continue being a part of this community, we're not going to send this to you anymore. And we had to make that internal decision. I think, we went from sending the Responsive Weekly just transparently to like 20, 30, 40,000 people to now like, I think 4,000 people.
Yeah, somewhere
something like that.
Yeah.
And that's a decision we had to make. So Tim says, keep me on the list. You're on the list, Tim. If you're here in this room, you're on the list. So we got you. But I think that's something we need to have more open conversations about. Like, how do we make sure that we're not continuing to berate people for no reason? So I think it's an important concept. Someone talked about lapsed donors. So let's end on lapsed donors. I'm going to give my opinion, and then I want your quick take, Megan, and then we got to wrap this thing up.
And then we're out.
Yeah, we got to just go. So I think we are not bold enough to ask the right questions to donors that stop giving. I think it's I can't speak anymore. This is why they stopped inviting me to the Responsive Weekly. I think it's perfectly fine to ask a donor that hasn't given to you intentionally, like, hey, we noticed that you were supporting our organization and partnering with us for the last 2 years, 1 year, last year, 20 years, whatever it is. And over the last year and a half, we haven't seen the same engagement that we've seen previously. Like, how could we, like, why is that? And are there ways that we could better connect with you to the cause that would better serve you? Just ask the questions. Like, if they're a lapsed donor, what we tend to do is we figure out these like cool campaigns where we're going to ask them for more money. It's like, well, what if we just ask them why they're not giving right now? Let's start there. They're not giving to you, right? Like, what's the harm?
You're not losing the donation. It's already done for the moment.
I highly encourage asking lapsed donors why they're not giving. I highly encourage asking lapsed donors why they're not giving multiple times. I think it's perfectly fine. They're not giving to you. They're not supporting your cause. They're not engaged. It's great to ask them. So, Megan, any other comments there before we wrap?
I definitely agree. I think especially if you have that data of like, there was a commitment over some period of time and then it changed. I think the second somebody doesn't, like the first time they don't respond to your campaign might not be the moment to ask, just because lapsed donors generally don't consider themselves lapsed. Like that is an in-house nonprofit thing that we've put onto donors, but I'm definitely a lapsed donor at some nonprofits. And what it really means is I forgot, or like I gave to someone else that month because of something happening. And I think if I got like a, hey, Megan, what happened? Why don't you love us anymore? What's going on? The first time it happened, I'd be like, whoa, that's too much. But if it was like, you stopped being a monthly donor, you've been giving to us regularly for every campaign for 2 years, and now you're not, ask the question, what have you got to lose?
Yeah, for sure. And I think doing it in a human way, like treat it like a human, like, hey, Megan, you stopped showing up on Thursdays. Like, we miss you. Where have you been? Like, you can do that type of thing. Like, hey, you're an important part of this. You've helped us make a huge impact. Like, how can we get you further and connected to the cause? Yeah. All good stuff. That's a wrap.
That is a wrap. We are out of time. Thank you all for your questions. As always, I wish we could get to every single one. We do look over them afterwards and plan accordingly for future topics. We're never ignoring you. I will see you next week. Thank you, Noah. It was great to have you back.
Yes, I love being a part of this community. Miranda, huge shout out to you. Thanks for being vulnerable and getting up on stage with us. We'll see you all next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.